Okay, are we about ready to get started? I think so. Let's see. I need this one. Okay. Hello everybody. And I still look like a pale something or other ghost. Alright, I am just taking a moment to clean these spectacles. So I can read. And we're getting into what is it? Chapter 11 of the Cloven Tree tonight. I missed reading last week because my D&D group was meeting on Wednesday, and that we have to meet when we can meet. So there you have it. All right, so here we go. Jumping in, Chapter 11, Courting Order. Okay. The plan seemed to be working, Owen thought. The 12 of them had easily come to the inner keep, led by Barnes, who had scouted the building earlier and who skillfully led them around the slave parties they had encountered in the first tunnels. Now, beneath the keep, they entered it using a shaft that seemed designed as trash dump for ashes or corpses. Whatever they had intended to drop, the hole was unused or cleaned, and going up through it, they entered the inner keep itself, coming to a smaller room that was basically a closet for the first hall. The hall itself, 100 yards or more in length, was still less than half the depth of the keep, or so Owen judged, but was nearly all of the keep's width. The far wall was divided into thirds by two wide passages. In the center section, 30 feet from that wall, was a dais, or dais, however you want to pronounce it, that was raised a foot above the rest of the floor, centered to the wall behind it and directly in front of the door to the inner court. On the dais was an altar that resembled nothing so much as a stone couch with ends that sloped upward. Torches were placed next to the altar at both ends. From them and the ones placed in sconces on the walls, Owen could see that the wall of the central section came into the chamber about 10 feet farther than either other portion of the inner wall. A part of it, anyway, Owen muttered under his breath, as his eyes, adjusting to the brightness of the room after the tunnels, now saw that the section that jutted into the room did not consist of the whole wall's height, but was only as high as it was wide. This block of stone, Owen saw with his eyes still adjusting, was directly in the center of the midsection, right against the wall. Directly in the middle of that was a throne set so it would look at the altar. Brask seems to have a healthy self-opinion, Barnes muttered to Owen. Owen snorted lightly, and Barnes turned to Otherin, the chief wizard. There's the book, I think, on the altar. The elf mage nodded, and Owen looked at the altar. The angle was poor, but on the stone pedestal he could see the edge of a book. Would it be in the very first chamber, he asked. He would not let his underlings study it alone or in private, and this is a sorceress study chamber. Look at the design. He said that, forgetting Owen's informal training. It's the book, he stated, after he looked at Owen and remembered. We shall see, Otherin remarked, and the elven mages strode from their southwest alcove toward the altar. Cautiously but quickly they studied the dais and pedestal, searching for traps, magical and mechanical. After that, they approached the pedestal of the altar and the book itself, studying that as well. Otherin's breath caught after he opened it, and though the 9 of them left in the small room did not hear his whisper, they knew what he was saying. It doth be the writing of the Glee sage. It hath the ancient runes. Owen still thought it was too easy. Then behind the elves the block of stone opened. 3 men who could only be sorcerers stepped out, and it all went to the dung heap. "Blisterin!" Owen heard one of them shout, and a wave of darkness assaulted the elves from behind. A fenworm caliber bolt blasted the sorcerer back into the room inside the stone block, and from that room a shout arose. Deeper in the main keep, a horn sounded. Barnes charged into the hall as one of the elven wizards was coming back to his feet. "To me! To me!" Barnes shouted as 4 more sorcerers entered the hall from the room behind the throne. Another horn call sounded, and a drum could be heard outside, beating a rhythm that could only be a call for stand to. Owen reloaded his crossbow, using the tension release clamp. Loading a new bolt, with main strength alone, he threw the lever back to re-tension his bow, and less than a dozen seconds after his first bolt, a second caught another sorcerer in the belly, also sending him flying into the stone block's inner chamber. The rest of the squad had boiled past him as he was loading and shooting, and Owen fell in behind them, heading to the altar. "Illumini!" one of the elf mages shouted, blasting the sorcerers with a volley of lights that exploded ever closer to them. The lights were not very powerful, but this weird was at once difficult to thwart and distracting enough to provide the rest of the squad cover as they moved to the altar. Letting the wizards engage the sorcerers, Owen removed his pack and pulled 3 more of his bows out of it. "Basin, Flandrina, and Rick," he shouted, throwing a crossbow to each, forgetting in his haste to address them by their titles. They didn't care at that point. "Shoot them into the ranks coming down the halls." Having seen the effect on the 2 sorcerers, they did not argue. "Given to me to reload." Liston and Barnes started scattering caltrops on the floor in front of the altar as the horn again sounded, and the corridors started to fill with the sound of running warriors. The mages on both sides were sweating from their battle, but the sorcerers were worse off. Not only outnumbered, they had been spending several hours a day for the last several months studying advantageous several hours a day for the last several months. Advantageous when new weird charms and spells were learned, but it hindered them here, for their study was incomplete. Moreover, the wizards had been expecting battle. I said battle, but the word is actually combat. The wizards had been expecting combat when the sorcerers had not. 2 of the wizards, Arnest and Aldemar, shouted some word that made Owen think of a dragon's tail, and 3 of the sorcerers collapsed, dead or unconscious. A 4th sorcerer was visibly stunned until Liston's arrow briefly brought him awake before he fell asleep forever. Then legionnaires and orcs boiled into the hall. Otherin spoke a word, and behind the altar 2 walls of fire sprang up, sealing a corridor from the dais to the main door of the inner keep. "Preserving our retreat to the courtyard," Owen noted before he had no more time to think as he reloaded the crossbows. Liston was thankful for the mages. Walls of fire appeared in the 10-yard-wide corridors, turning them into funnels with perfect fields for archery. "The crossbows definitely help," he judged, as he saw the bolts blast into undead, knocking down a dozen or more, usually pinning 1 or 2 to the wall. Concentrating on orcs, he saw one of his targets pull a legionnaire in front of him, the arrow landing in the undead's chest instead of the orc's. Turning, the legion man ran the orc through the chest, and Liston laughed, until the corpse warrior threw the body into the flames, and it did not burn. Most of the walls of fire illusions he noted sourly, disappeared, and the orcs' slow assault took on greater speed. Illumini, he heard the wizard shout again, this time releasing a massive flare. Blinded, the goblin stumbled into the caltrops and died almost to an orc, but the legionnaires were now past the choke points. 8 more bolts and arrows were loosed before Therion Flandrena shouted, "Blades!" And Barnes, Liston, and 2 lords stowed or discarded their distance weapons for their swords. Basin, a combat mage, kept the crossbow he had, and taking a bolt, used a brief charm to reset the tension on the bow. Loading it, he found and aimed for the largest group of the undead. He spoke again, a weird this time, and the bolt flew into the knot of legionnaires and exploded, incinerating nearly 20 of the corpse men. But over 100 others were in the hall, with more coming. Basin next concentrated on the tunnels, trying to seal them off. First, he turned to the right-hand tunnel as the full mages were casting fire and lightning at the enemy. Seeing that the tunnels were square, but that round arches supported them, he cast lightning into the passage, hitting as many of the arches as he could. Then he blasted each corner of the wall. With a huge roar, over 20 feet of the wall and ceiling collapsed. How's my sound? Okay, good. Turning toward the left-hand tunnel, he prepared to block it as well and caught an orcan arrow in his chest. First of the missionaries to die. Owen's next bolt blasted the archer into the throne. Owen kept using the crossbows, not wanting to rely on his sword training until he had to. He had loosed over 12 bolts in the first 5 minutes by himself alone, but he was running out of the hard-to-make shafts, and he started to put them away. "Owen, the sorcerer summoneth golems," Otherin said. "You must destroy them. We are too busy with the corpse men." "I can kill the mage. It doth be too late. Kill him, and the golems will simply go mad." The flow of legionnaires and orcs slowed as the heavy tread of the artificial beasts soon filled the corridor, and Owen gaped at seeing them. They were huge. No wonder the ceiling was 100 feet high. And maybe these are just the small ones, Owen thought. Looking at the first 50-foot-plus walking statue, as the 50-foot walking statue started into the hall, and he thought there were several more behind it. From the shadows in the corridor, only 1 or 2 were 2-legged. "Owen, its ankle!" Otherin shouted. As it stepped forward with its right foot, Owen blasted the left shin with his crossbow. With a tremendous noise, the bolt ricocheted off the stone leg, and Owen looked on in shock at the point of contact. The golem, a 60-foot-tall carving of a bearded man, shifted its weight as it continued to step forward, and the left shin began to crack. Then it exploded as the weight was too much for the distressed stone, and the statue fell backward into the corridor. The sound of stone falling upon stone was deafening. With satisfaction, Owen watched the corridor choke with rock, raising a wall over 20 feet high in the narrow place. Then, with even more satisfaction, Owen began to raise his last bow for a shot at the surviving sorcerer, who was staring open-mouthed. It had taken too long, though, and he heard the shout, "Bow's son, beware!" Right as he triggered the weapon, an legion blade pierced the worm leather on his side. Liston's sword was covered with orc blood. He did not think that would help when fighting legionnaires, but it wouldn't hurt. Still, he envied the young lords. Whenever they struck a corpse man, it fell, while he was stuck with having to behead them and hope that he could cut off the sword hand before the beheaded warrior could strike back. The blast flasks he had been throwing into their ranks had helped, but he was almost out of them. Roaring, he swung his blade in furiously, and the press of opponents fell back for a moment. Quickly, he searched in his pack for a last oil bomb. He almost didn't find it. "There you are," he breathed. He lit it in one of the torches and turned just in time to see that 2 undead, who had driven themselves between him and Barnes, The closest one was already swinging, and he felt the shock of the sword as the sword destroyed his kidney and hip. He had the presence of mind as he fell into the approaching undead to maintain his grip on the liquid explosive. When the fuse entered the flask, his body was nearly incinerated by the explosion. Therion and Thames had charged fully into the Legionnaires, as befit their training and family reputation. It was a very risky tactic, but it was crucial that the undead not be allowed to form up. Besides, while they had not yet revealed their true identities, they were still immune to the distemper, and so the undead could only kill them. Just as important, they had blades of rebonded steel that would kill the undead if they were ordinary men, as if they were ordinary men, and they had armor of the best dragonhide. So one behind the other, with their round shields on their backs and the hilts of their ordinary swords extending up past their necks for extra protection, they charged. They cut off heads or stabbed into chests of their enemies when they could, and severed arms or hands or legs when they could not. Moving constantly, they sought the captain of the undead, whose death would affect the undead bond much more severely. The captain of this battalion, however, knew that such a tactic would be used and wasn't caught. Recognizing them for who and what they were, he sent over a platoon against them. He then led the assault on the altar, recognizing the mages as the greatest threat. He sent a squad to their right, a squad to their left, and a squad to their front, so that he could lead a squad toward the Lord's flank, but would then take the dais from as near to behind as possible. They would kill the wizards, and it would then be inevitable. But first, the man with the crossbow. "Bow's son, beware!" Therion shouted. Feeling the blade cut into his side, Owen bellowed in pain and rage. He sounded so much like a worm that even the undead were caused to startle. Instinctively, he swung the crossbow as he shouted. Otheron made good use of the brief respite. As Owen swung, he grasped a vial in his pouch, and hurling it to the floor, shouted, "Inspirion!" This weird, the breath of life, staggered the undead assault, as fully 1/10 of their entire number was directly caught in the blast, and their bond was shaken. Few of them were killed by it, but as it faded, Owen's crossbow smashed upward into the legion captain's chin, the force of the blow destroying the weapon as it sent the head flying. Again the bond was shaken as its power surged out of their captain, and he fell dead. A dozen of the nearest legionnaires also collapsed as the bond was ripped from them, and the missionaries quickly retook the dais, though not without cost. "We must leave," Otheron said, noting that Liston and the elf mage Splenleth had been killed when the undead closed to the altar. "Yes," the mortally wounded Barnes agreed, looking at the dead elf. "Leave me one flask, though." "Can you move, Bow's son?" Arnest asked. "Yes, damn! My best crossbow, ruined." Then he saw Barnes, and he dropped the weapon, the implement already forgotten. "Let me carry you," Owen said, practically pleading. Barnes shook his head. "It is his right as a Legion fighter to choose when he cannot continue," Thames said. Owen started. He had not seen them come back to the dais. "We are running out of time." He pointed, and from the tunnel where the golem had crushed his fellows, more legionnaires and orcs were slowly pouring into the hall over the rubble. More than 100 of them now supplemented the initial assault survivors. Another platoon was coming down off the rubble, and these cautiously joined the others as they formed up to assault again. "I think it is time, Aldemar," Arnest said. "The weird is highly dangerous and only experimental if the sorcerers try to interfere." "They are fallen or fled. Young McOwen drove off the last," Aldemar assented. "So do it as we discussed?" Arnest nodded, and the two began casting. Each mage threw a bottle in the air toward the approaching enemy, muttering almost muttering almost. Aldemar broke the bottles, and Arnest caused the contents to form a wall of dust that glittered slightly in the firelight. Arnest spoke again, and the dust particles streaked toward the advancing enemy. Then Aldemar shouted, Corpian anivios inspiri. The particles settled, some to the ground and some on the corpses, but more than half of them landed on the approaching warriors, now more than 200 strong. For long seconds it seemed that whatever the intent, the weird had failed completely. Then an orc started scratching, then another, and more. Then one orc let out a scream, which was abruptly choked to a gurgle. The orc collapsed, jerking spasmodically and violently enough that the snapping of his bones was audible throughout the bloodied room. Still he kept spasming, and his body bulged. Owen saw the armor on the corpse breaking, bending, and falling off as the body contorted. Then its side burst open, and a blood-streaked form emerged from the corpse, now just a ruin. The creature stood, and Owen yelled in shocked recognition, Fentrol! The spell had worked. Hundreds, thousands of spores had been released. The orcs caught in it were a bonus. Due to the prototypical nature of the weird, it had been intended that it would have no effect on the living at all. On the undead, though, the effect was more devastating. Each spore that had bound itself to them grew at a voracious rate, and bound by the weird to tap into the legion bond, they sought the undead like prey. The other spores grew quickly as well, accelerated by the weird, and suddenly a wall of fen golems separated the castle garrison from their opponents, the trolls pregnant with the desire to devour the flesh of the undead. Yes, Aldemar shouted. Owen, that wizard of yours is a genius. Dozens of trolls were hounding each corpse warrior in sight, most hardly noticing the orcs now, though some were looking for their new prey. A wall of fire arose before the dais, cutting off the scene. Let us hope it doth not work too well, Theron said, after raising the illusion between them and the enemy. Nevertheless, well done, Aldemar, Arnest. Very well done. Thank you, Grey Master, the two wizards said, almost in unison, referring to the elf mage's rank. Otherin nodded, and with the two lords he started from the dais toward the main doors to the courtyard, walking between the walls of fire he had originally raised to seal open that corridor. The rest of the squad that remained followed, though Aldemar and Owen tarried for a moment. That's why he collects those spores, Owen said to the mage, who did not reply, sensing that the comment was rhetorical. Then Owen's gaze fell back upon Barnes, the mortally wounded man struggling to stand where he could light the fuse of his oil bomb. Their eyes met, and Owen was afraid to speak. From his pack he grabbed a signal flare and lit it in one of the torches. Then he leaned across the altar and handed it to Barnes, their eyes meeting again. After an eternal second, Owen turned and passed between the walls of fire, with Aldemar following. Oxbow felt uneasy as they waited. The signal hammers of the dwarves had relayed that everyone was in place, and then they had to wait until the three archers had quietly passed the word that the flesh demon and the legionnaires with him had gone. That was part of the uneasiness, he realized. He did not like having those men as isolated as they were. They've got livers, by heaven, he thought to himself, respecting their courage. As he continued to brood, however, he knew that they were only part of his disquiet. The fortress itself, he realized as they waited in the darkness. If he had had his way some 30 years before, this place would have been completely razed, with foundation and pits uprooted. But the Killian raiders had not had the manpower or equipment for that task. The Crown Prince could not at the time give them the aid required, and after the 11th battle, every one of them had wanted to leave. Now he was back, and the place had been rebuilt. The futility of that was bothering him most of all. The sentries confirm that the demon's company is out of sight now for hours, Brander whispered. The guard changed 2 hours ago, and everyone is in place. Excuse me. Oxbow looked at the stars through a hole in the shed and took a deep breath. Clearing his head, he calculated the time. 3 hours after midnight, or near enough. It was his plan. It was his decision. Please relay to Lellebran and Barnes, he said, for once completely devoid of his normal dialect. You may begin. The dwarf nodded and disappeared down the hole in the floor to the tunnels, and the men readied their bows, even the wizards. If surprise was lost, they would have to make the most of the first few minutes of the battle, and most likely be killed in any event, unless quite a bit went their way. The minutes dragged on. A long wait'll be harder on the nerve, Oxbow noted professionally, pedantically, but easier on the health. A short wait'll mean a hard fight. The others silently concurred. Brander came back into the shed from the tunnel. We would not want to go back through the tunnels with them pursuing us. Again the team members nodded. An hour of eternity they waited, and then Braster sighed. Make ready, I think horns are blowing in the main keep. Seconds later, all doubt was removed as the horns and drums began to blow in the lesser keep and the courtyards, all of them unendingly crying, Stand to! Stand to! The drakelings in the courtyard began to howl. Oxbow and the other 9 men of the yard squad burst out of the shed in the southwest corner of the inner courtyard, bows drawn, looking for targets. Castor, Hot Hands, and Blister were already servicing targets as quickly as possible, and within a minute the walls and towers belonged to the Overwatch. The orcs in the courtyard were not much more fortunate, and the only success that the castle garrison enjoyed in the first 5 minutes of the court battle was to close the gates to the outer court. Oxbow had been nearly a prophet when he had the missionaries engaged at this time of the night. Unaware of the old tunnels, and with the sheer veracity of Curtis's deception, the commanders of the fort were entirely convinced that the raiders were going after Krauger. Brask had not even told his orc captains that raiders were in the Killia, so neither of the two had taken more than normal steps to ensure defense, and the night guard rotations were minimal. Compounding that, the archer company of Abrag's battalion had been drilling heavily for over a month, as Abrag saw both need and an opportunity to one-up the other goblin commander. His archers had risen to the challenge, drilling beautifully, and as a reward their company commander had stood them down for 3 days. Like bored, celebrating soldiers anywhere, the drinking had commenced immediately and had been impossible to confine to just a single company. Gorogoroth, the captain of the other battalion, had flogged 17 of his command just to stem his unit from imbibing. The missionaries closed to within 100 yards of the lesser keep, keeping the chained dragons on their left. At that range they could loose arrows for hours, but more importantly, it allowed them to catch as many of the orcs as possible in the doorway. Each of these archers was capable, at that distance, of accurately shooting over 5 arrows a minute. With 12 archers, that averaged more than an arrow per second. Castor watched the rest of the courtyard for his position was on top of the lesser keep, and thus he had no shot at the orcs below him. For minutes the orcs were pinned in the keep's main gate by the volume of arrows the missionaries were loosing. Inside it, shouts resounded. Then several smaller doors opened, and the orcs boiled out. Forced now to divide their shafts between several targets, their archery fell to 1 shaft per gate per quarter of a minute. That was too much time for them to allow the orcs, though now Castor could shoot them in the back. Soon after 100 orcs soon over 100 orcs were in the courtyard, and the three mages abandoned their bows and began seeking a means to block their right flank as the dragons blocked their left. Some other dragons were shackled up against the main keep to their right rear, but nothing stood between them and the western wall of the keep, but a shed or two and several haystacks. Castor was one step ahead of them. "Idle!" he shouted. "The haywains!" Right next to the largest group of stacks, 4 teams had been loading hay when the alarm sounded. The slaves who had been performing the task fled once their orc overseers had been killed, but the horses and wagons were still ready to finish the loading. Eidel spoke, and one of the laden wagons began moving. He spoke again, and the door on the back of the wagon fell open, spilling hay and straw through the courtyard. Wellman did the same, but Cormac saw an even better opportunity. Each haystack had its own hay derrick. Both the derricks, the weight-driven booms that lifted the hay, were mounted on common framework for their foundations. The last 2 wains were still attached to the drive pulleys to reset the boom, but the counterweight slave power was not. Speaking a different kind of weird, Cormac added strength to the wagon, rigging, boom, and tackle of the derrick, and to the horses. Then he spoke a command, and the horses leapt forward. With a huge crash of breaking wood and rending metal, the 2 derricks mounted on that frame were ripped from the ground, knocking over 2 of the largest haystacks as the derricks were dragged through them. Hay covered the courtyard, and the 3 archers in the overwatch quickly put fire arrows into it. Oxbow lit 4 signal flares and threw them into the fodder as well, and the mages cast fire at any section that had not yet ignited. Cormac then brought 2 of the wagons to the center of the courtyard between the drakes and the firewall. Speaking a quick enchantment, he blasted the wheels off of one of the wagons and knocked off one of its sides. Then he burned holes and slits in the remaining side so that the 9-foot-high wall was converted into a 20-foot long, 2-inch thick emergency fortification. As the mages returned to the fighting, Oxbow scanned the battle, noting that the goblins were still unorganized. He was thrilled with the results so far. Normally, even orcs would have been formed by now, he thought, but the chaotic mess could not be expected to last, and they had not fought their way out yet. Then a thrown orc voice bellowed, silencing the courtyard. "Abrag, you wart-ass son of an elf! Form your command! Mind your tongue, Gorgoroth!" Abrag looked left and right, but didn't focus on anyone. The archers up above gave up any idea of feathering Abrag. They knew Gorogoroth's reputation made that idea useless. "I know this business just like you. Later for that." Then, taking his own advice, he shouted, his thrown voice reverberating off all the walls. "Gorogors reform! 12th formation!" Cormac paused, hearing that name, but Oxbow had more immediate uses for the brief respite. Whatever. He and Braster took the other wagon that had been brought to the center and positioned it just to the left of the one Cormac had converted. Then, after they freed the horses, Cormac and Eidel combined to turn it on its side, none too soon. The orcs were charging the wagons even as the second one landed. The orcs angled for the overturned wagon, rightly noting that it would be harder to defend. Quickly, despite the arrows of the missionaries, over a platoon of goblins reached it, preparing to swarm over and around it. Eidel grimaced and, speaking another weird, caused the overturned wagon and its hay to burst into flame, leaving only 2 gaps for the orcs to try and storm through, both of them sighted by fire. At that point, a company of legionnaires entered the inner court from the outer. After closing the gate again, they formed up and charged at the yard squad, orcs forming up and following behind them. The three wizards began sending a frenzy of fire and lightning bolts at the undead, and Oxbow switched to his crossbows. His first bolt knocked down a half-dozen of them, but it was Cormac who found a way to break them. Speaking quickly, he levitated the wood pieces that had been blasted from the wagon, sending them flying at the Legion men. He caused them to splinter and then burst into flame as they buried themselves in lifeless bodies for the most part, and to a lesser amount in goblin flesh. 10 of the undead blazed like torches, and the rest diverted all their efforts to keep from following suit. More fire arrows landed among the undead company, and Vlanchra, their company commander, ordered his unit to pull back. "Abrag!" Gorogoroth shouted. "Where in all hells are your archers? Officers with bows aren't enough. We've mages to deal with." No reply came as both orc captains fell to the task of reforming their soldiers for another assault. Braster and Oxbow were still using their bows, Oxbow having switched from his crossbows when the legionnaires fell back. The other men were reduced to blades, with the orcs too close to them. This compelled the mages to aid the swordsmen, leaving the overwatch as the main archery contingent. Abreg and Gorgoroth sent 2 charges against the improvised wall, expecting the archers to have spent their shafts. Castor, however, had seen to it that the 3 men of the overwatch each had over 20 full heavy quivers of 50 arrows each, and the charges were broken with 2 men in the overwatch still having arrows in their 4th quivers. Gorgoroth had had enough of them. "Craggit, take your company up the wall and get those feathermongers. Captain Vlanchra, take your lads with them, if you please, and give my boys some backbone." Wordlessly, the Legion captain nodded, and over 70 legionnaires accompanied the orcs to storm the walls. "We're in for a fight," Braster noted grimly. "Any orc that can order Legion officers is a serious opponent." Oxbow harumphed grimly, and the orcs swarmed to press the wagon wall again. The rain of arrows from above fell off, and soon the men in the courtyard were too heavily engaged to see what had happened to their brethren. Smashing an orc with the axe he had been issued a month before, Oxbow quickly looked at the battle as he fought to hold the gap between the burning wagon and the first one. 2 orcs came at him, the first one swinging his sword in a downward 2-handed stroke. Oxbow stepped into the blow and to the side, ramming his knee into the goblin's stomach. Slightly out of position, he had no better option with the second orc than to deflect his thrusting sword with his armored left arm. As with his right, he smashed the fanged creature in the face with the flat of his axe. Then Oxbow shoved it into the burning wagon, knocking it into the blaze with a left-handed punch to the throat. The first orc started to rise, but Oxbow stunned him with an axe flat to the temple. Grabbing him by the neck and groin, the old Fenlander lifted the goblin before him and hurled him like a log into the next group coming to the gap. Startled, they instinctively tried to catch their comrade and were knocked back into the next squad of orcs, causing a tangle that Oxbow judged would give him 15 seconds. He surveyed the battle again and decided that it was time. Ripping his horns from his belt, he blew 4 blasts on it. And the shed from where they had come smashed open as the dwarves burst through the door carrying a dwarven team lance, nearly 20 feet long. The dwarves had had to assemble it by screwing the sections together and then reinforcing the joints with clamps. The blade itself was a masterpiece of dwarven battle engineering. It had come in 2 pieces, but once joined and removed from its cases, was as tall as Brander and harder to break or bend than a solid forging. Cunningly crafted, the blade would drive through oak, iron, and flesh, the penetrated body being driven further up the blade until it was cut in pieces. Behind the blade were mounts for shields to deflect the severed heads, limbs, and torsos, but the deadliest features of the lance were its harnesses. Each dwarf was strapped to the weapon and each other. This spread the shock of impact evenly throughout the team, but more importantly, utterly united their separate momentum to that of the lance, effectively making them one being whose total mass was over 3 tons. After less than 100 feet, they smashed into the orcs at nearly 30 miles an hour. Really? Over a much greater distance, they would have had to fall to a slower pace, but Brander had correctly judged that the orcs would not be able to scatter effectively, so their sprint was not wasted. I think 30 is a little far-fetched, but okay. The key to their attack was drive. They could not allow themselves to be stopped, or the orc captain would have them swarmed over if he was even moderately competent, which was an even bet. For this reason, Brander used the standard dwarven doctrine of targeting the orcan officers, and Abrag swallowed fearfully as the dwarves, recognizing him by the gilding of his armor, started driving in his direction to kill him. His soldiers' efforts to intercept the dwarves were nearly futile. Using the power of their race, the dwarves magically struck at the metal of the enemy's weapons. Swords snapped, shield rivets popped, axe heads rusted instantly, and buckles shattered. Then, as their strength began to wane, the dwarves simply resorted to diverting the blows of the enemy weapons. Until the dwarves were too exhausted to use this ability, the orcs may as well have been armed with twigs. Gorgoroth, however, had one more card to play, not even bothering to count the orcs between Abreg and Brander. He grabbed his own horn and blew 2 deep, ringing blasts. Out from the lesser keep came the 3 companies that he had held in reserve, commanded by Orgroth, his second in command. These orcs saw the dwarven battle team, and many of their faces paled, but they did not hesitate. With discipline, the fresh orcs surged through their brethren, encircling the dwarves to cut them off from support. Also, stiffening the resistance in front of the dwarves, they slowed them to a crawl, and their numbers swamped the dwarves' magic. Brander was forced to abandon his advance and form his dwarves into a shield ring around the weapon or be overwhelmed. Whatever his faults, Brask knows good soldiery, Brander noted, unhappily, as the orcs renewed their assault on the wagons once again. Oxbow scanned the courtyard. They had done very well so far. Between them, the different sections of the mission platoon had killed, incapacitated, or wounded more than 700 of the Orcan garrison, perhaps more than 1,000, for the archers had taken many, not all of whom could he see, with the dwarves accounting for 1/5 of those casualties by themselves. Now, though, the orcs in the courtyard numbered 1,000 and counting, with more than half of them fresh. The archers would be of little help going on. Up above, he heard the distinct sound of Castor working his ratchet bow to pump out arrows with every crank. That meant he was fighting orcs between the battlements. How the man fed so many shafts into the machine he did not know, and it would be of little use to ground fighters unless it drew more orcs up the wall to fight the archers. Before the assault could swarm them under, he went running to the drakes. The nearest one was a 60-foot long beast that was muzzled with a chain as well as shackled by neck, legs, and tail. Oxbow swung his axe two-handedly and struck the chain, holding down its left front leg. The chain did not break from the blow, but the link was damaged, and the beast snapped it with a jerk. Now, with its front leg freed, the beast was able to fully brace itself, drawing the chain around its muzzle taut. Oxbow stepped to that chain and hewed through it with a single stroke. The chain snapped, nearly hitting him as it unraveled. Then he dived as the wild-eyed dragon turned its maw toward him and attacked. And that is the end of the chapter, so we get to leave on a little cliffhanger there. That was the best chapter so far, and the one before that was the best chapter up to that point. So the book is getting better. I think it started out rough, but I enjoyed that chapter quite a lot. All right. So that'll be that for this week in the Cloven Tree. Let's see who all's around. Is anybody around? Is anybody playing anything tonight? Count BB's around playing Generation Zero. Ren Flames. I haven't rated Ren Flames for a while. He's playing Left 4 Dead 2. I've never seen it. So let's go see if he's wants some company, shall we? I will head on over there and I will see you in a moment. Stick with me. We'll get this raid going. Here we go.
Yo, Manip with the raid!
Whoa!
Let's go!